Welcome to Unholy Histories, the Humanist Heritage podcast brought to you by Humanist UK. I'm Andrew Copson, Chief Executive of Humanist UK.
And I'm Madeline Goodall, Head of the Humanist Heritage Project.
We're the hosts of this new podcast series where we will be speaking with experts about Britain's humanist history,
uncovering the people, events and ideas that have shaped both humanist thought and our national life. In 1965, a packed hall at Cambridge University watched as James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. clashed over race, justice and the meaning of freedom. But that moment was just one flashpoint in a much larger struggle. Across the United States and here in Britain, activists, writers and thinkers were challenging injustice, confronting systems of power and asking fundamental questions about equality, dignity and how we ought to live. Some drew on religious traditions, but many others looked instead to humanist ideas, to reason, to shared humanity, and to a vision of ethics grounded in human experience rather than divine authority. In this episode of Unholy Histories, we explore the connections between civil rights movements on both sides of the Atlantic and the humanist ideas and thinkers that helped to shape them. And to explore this transatlantic story, we're joined by Dr. Nicholas Buccola, the Dr. Jules L. Whitehill Professor of Humanism and Ethics at Claremont McKenna College and author of The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr. and the Debate over Race in America, and Dr. Angelina Osborne, British historian, researcher, heritage consultant and author whose books include 100 Great Black Britons, a celebration of the extraordinary contribution of key figures of African or Caribbean descent to British life. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Andrew Copson.
Hello, well, thank you very much for joining us. I thought we could start with each of you telling us a little bit about your work and research and what it was that drew you to those areas of study. Let's start with you, Nicholas.
Yeah, I teach American political thought as my broad area of study, and I spent most of the first part of my career as a scholar studying Frederick Douglass. So my dissertation and eventually my first book was about the political thought of Frederick Douglass, and I was really interested in Douglass as a kind of liberal thinker, somebody who's primarily concerned about liberty first and foremost, but I was especially interested in how Douglass thought about the responsibilities we have to each other, the sort of responsibilities we have to stand up for one another's liberty. And fast forward a few years, my work really shifted to James Baldwin. As you mentioned, I've thought a bit about Baldwin by way of his debate with William F. Buckley. That project allowed me to think about the civil rights and conservative movements together, which is something I've continued to do. My last book was about Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Barry Goldwater as leaders of freedom movements. And I have another book about Baldwin, sort of Baldwin and Love is my theme in my next book, and that'll hopefully come out early next year. So that's some of the things I've been thinking about lately.
And what was it that drew you to Baldwin in particular?
I'd always, knew I needed to read more James Baldwin. Like a lot of people, I read a little bit as an undergraduate, a little bit as a graduate student, and then just kind of stumbled into an invitation to write about the debate or write about Baldwin. And then I stumbled into the debate. And once I really got into engaging Baldwin, I couldn't stop. Baldwin, to me, is just one of the most wise and insightful humans ever to have lived. And so the key thing would be, I really find really compelling how Baldwin can take, any moral, political, even aesthetic question. He can dig through to that grave question of self that sort of lies beneath. And I feel like that, to me, really struck me as true in terms of my experience in the world. And so that's really what drew me to Baldwin and still has a hold on me.
Angelina, what about your work and why you ended up studying what you're studying?
Well, I started working for a small social enterprise called Every Generation. We were really interested in exploring sort of hidden histories, particularly the histories around Black British history, the history of the African presence in the UK. While there had been lots of work being done, certainly in the academy, there was lots of work that's being done on this issue. There was nothing that was sort of really being communicated to sort of wider audiences. And so started looking at that research, doing work in this social enterprise that I said Every Generation. And then in 2010, I decided to do my PhD in history. 3 years before that, I had been involved in what was known then as the sort of bicentenary of the Acts to abolish the trade and trafficking in African people, the acts that the British Parliament passed, I should say, rather, back in 1807. And I was sort of interested in the fact that there was so much that was quite celebratory and backslapping, and on the part of the government. It was actually the Blair government at the time, who sort of pushed this through, actually ostensibly, in my view, to really sort of show the humanitarian positioning of government. And I was curious about that. I kept thinking about a quote by the great Trinidadian historian Eric Williams, who kept saying in my head, it feels like the reason that Britain invented slavery was to abolish it. And I kept thinking that we're not hearing about enslavement and what it actually involved, what it meant, how Britain benefited from it. So I actually researched an organization called the West India Committee. They were a very influential lobbying group in the 18th and early 19th century, really working, using all of their resources to prolong enslavement and to prevent emancipation from happening. So I wrote my thesis on that organization. Since then, I've just been continuing to work really sometimes at universities and most of the time with community organizations researching different elements around Black British history, Caribbean history. And that's what I do currently.
So what drew you to it was that, as you say, the unwritten nature of it, the underexplored, unexcavated nature of it.
Yeah, the underexplored nature of it and the one-sidedness of it, of how there's this continuous kind of narrative that we're supposed to adhere to, which is that Britain is this great liberator, this great anti-abolitionist. And yes, the British people were very instrumental in campaigning to abolish enslavement. But what we're not hearing about often is what the enslaved people were doing themselves to end enslavement. And I was interested in that, and I was interested in what Black British people were doing in that period as well, and going forward. It's a narrative that continuously is being distorted, and so I try to bring both views into light.
As always, there's so much there in both of those answers that I feel like we could go into and pull out. Our kind of overarching theme of this episode is civil rights and the civil rights movement, and that how it manifested, how it operated on both sides of the ocean. So I guess to start with, it might be useful to kind of define what we mean when we're talking about civil rights in that concept. Nicholas, I don't know if you want to set us up there.
Period of history that I've been working on recently, like the sort of mid-1950s to the mid-1960s. So often in the US, we say that the civil rights movement and identify that era. But I think that a lot of historians have pointed out rightly that this is like one phase in a long, long struggle. And we can think about the civil rights movement or civil rights movements throughout history, of course. But I would say the way I would think about the concept generally is the sort of pursuit by way of activism, equal recognition and dignity in the political sphere, in the economic sphere, in the social sphere. That's just a really broad sweep. But I think that part of what we see going on in this era that I've been thinking about in these last two books is this attempt to, of course, pursue particular citizenship rights, opportunities to participate in politics in a lot of the sort of formal ways we often think about, like the right to vote, but also really an attention to the ways in which economic injustice has manifested itself in ways that have marginalized people throughout, in my case, studying American history and trying to figure out ways in which there's this intersection between the political rights and economic dignity. And so I think that's kind of the way I tend to think about it. And then, of course, the one last thing I'd say is that thing about that social piece is that certainly, in this last book about Martin Luther King, I was thinking a lot about the ways in which, sort of interactions in the social sphere are also relevant to one's feeling of equal standing in a society. And so that's kind of how I think about the sort of concept of civil rights generally.
Do you feel like that kind of maps, Angelina, onto your research, your writing about the context in Britain?
In some ways, yes. Britain passed the first Race Relations Act in, I think it was 1965, I believe. And that was a culmination of significant campaigning by different organizations that actually operated under an umbrella organization called the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination. And essentially what this organization did, it was about all people of African and African Caribbean heritage, and also of South Asian heritage, because they were all experiencing racism and discrimination in similar ways. So they got together. And actually, what's interesting is that when Martin Luther King was on his way to Sweden to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in late 1964, he actually visited some of the members of CARD, and they sort of sought advice from him, saying, how do we campaign? Give us some benefit of your experience. And that was in late 1964, which he did. It was a very short visit. He was here probably maybe one night and met with these individuals, amongst whom was Claudia Jones. Claudia Jones was one of the people who were present at those meetings. And the sad thing about Claudia Jones is that a few weeks later, it's literally maybe weeks later, a couple of weeks later, she was dead. She had died in her sleep, late 1964. So she wasn't able to even see the fruits. I mean, she saw, of course, while she was living, some of the fruits campaigning, but she sadly passed away in late 64, not long after that meeting.
I think I've heard you talk before about Claudia Jones and that concept of somebody burning so brightly, having this enormous impact and then being really cut off far too early in the case of Claudia Jones. I think as well, it's really interesting to me that there were these interactions between, I mean, it's natural, and certainly we see it in the history that we look at in the kind of, in humanism and non-religion, this crossover and kind of interplay between people in the US, people in the UK, learning from each other, visiting each other. I'm thinking about somebody like Eslander Robeson, I know, spoke at Conway Hall, for example, and again, that was very much in the context of the experience in America and what could be learned and shared.
And I guess that started even earlier with the humanist movement, because we had in 1911 when what was then called the Ethical Union, which is what Humanist UK used to be called, organised in 1911 a global anti-racism congress in London, which quite a large number of US activists travelled to, didn't they, Maddie?
Yeah, including W.E. Du Bois. So he was very inspired by the concept of the First Universal Races Congress, which was this idea of getting people from all over the world together in the light of science, to better understand each other, to foster better communications and understandings between countries. And yeah, Du Bois wrote about that in his own paper when he got home, about how it was this, incredibly bold, brave thing that unfortunately was both the first and the last of those congresses because of the outbreak of the First World War. So yeah, I guess there is that history, and like Nicholas was saying earlier, that idea of these different generations of activists building on the work of others that came before them, being kind of inspired often by those people that came before.
I was just thinking about Eslander Robeson, Paul Robeson's wife, when they came and they stayed in England quite a lot during the 1930s, because Paul Robeson was filming here, like Sanders of the River and a couple of other quite significant movies that he was in. And I'm thinking about the fact that Britain, centre of empire, drew many people from its empire to London, to the centre. And it's actually, I'm suggesting that Paul Robeson and his wife were pretty much influenced by the meeting. I mean, he met Jomo Kenyatta, because Jomo Kenyatta was in one of the movies that he was in, played a chief, an African chief. And he was very much influenced by these ideas, these anti-colonial, Pan-Africanist ideas. I'm suggesting that Paul Robeson was very much sort of influenced. His interactions with these individuals, I'm not sure if he met C.L.R. James, but he was very much influenced by the experience that he had of talking to these different people, these different thinkers that coalesced in London, centre of empire, which is kind of ironic, I think, given Britain's sort of colonial positioning back in the 1930s, that they would come to England, Padmore and others, to talk about and consider what needs to be done. And those would be the seeds of independence that was sown in the 30s at that time.
And obviously when they came here, they found progressive spaces in which they could speak. I mean, like we were saying, Eslander Robeson spoke at the Humanist House, Conway Hall in London. So I guess another reason is just, although it seems ironic, is I guess London was just also full of a lot of progressive venues, progressive people.
And universities.
Yeah, exactly. So these are heady days, the early 60s, aren't they? We're talking about 1965. That was the year, of course, as Sandra Robeson died, and also some of the other people we've been talking about. There's a lot going on in the early 60s. It is obviously heady days. And one specific event that we want to talk a little bit about, because of your work on this, Nicholas, is in 1965, the Baldwin-Buckley debate. So tell us a little bit about, first of all, the background to this debate.
February 18th, 1965, James Baldwin ends up at the Cambridge Union. The union had just celebrated its 150th anniversary to square off against William F. Buckley. And the motion before the House was resolved, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. It was the motion the students had proposed. And so the story behind the debate was something that nobody had really written much about. So my students and I tried to track down some of the students who were back in the day hosted the debate. And so, essentially Baldwin was on a book tour in the UK promoting the paperback release of Another Country, his third novel. And his publicist called the Cambridge Union and they said, well, we're a debating society, so he can't come here for an author event, but if he'll debate, we can host him. And so one thing led to another and a lot of twists and turns. And the one of the students had met this guy, William F. Buckley, who was the perfect person to play the role of, an opponent for Baldwin that night. And so, it's really a dramatic moment. You have the BBC is there, it's going to end up being, filmed and people see it around the world. It's sort of right in the midst of the Selma campaign for voting rights. And so it's at this really important moment in that phase of the civil rights revolution. And there's Baldwin, as Malcolm X would call him, the poet of the revolution, squaring off against William F. Buckley, who was really the poet of the counter-revolution. He was the leading, besides Barry Goldwater, who just, lost the campaign for the presidency as a conservative Republican candidate in 1964. Buckley was really the most recognizable conservative in the States. And so he was, this leading polemicist. He had been opposed to the civil rights movement at every turn. And so it was really, you couldn't have dreamt up a more sort of fitting matchup between two people who had radically different life experiences and radically different worldviews. So they were there that night for some intellectual fireworks.
So what were those competing visions of society that were being advanced at this point? I mean, and because we're interested more in humanist history, you can focus more on the good one, the James Baldwin one, if you want to. But what were these two visions, really?
I love the way Baldwin begins his speech. I mean, interestingly, in thinking about these questions in both sort of humanist register and a kind of theological register, he announces that he's there as a kind of Jeremiah, So he's, Baldwin was raised in Harlem storefront churches and became a young minister when he was a teenager. And then, he left the church at age 17. And Baldwin would often say that, people tell me that I left the church at 17, but remained forever a preacher. So he's there to preach a particular kind of gospel. And I think that in a broad sense, we can call it a humanist gospel, in a sense, because he's there to, really describe, what he calls different systems of reality that allow us to engage the world in different ways. And so part of what I think Baldwin does so beautifully in his speech at Cambridge, and I think this is like reflective of the vision that he brought into the debate that night, was he talks about the ways in which the doctrine of white supremacy has its sort of obvious victims. And so he talks about the catalog of disaster, the millions of details of every day that communicate to African Americans that their lives don't matter as much. And he sort of implicates Buckley in a lot of what he's done without saying it directly, that it's sort of in maintaining that structure of white supremacy. But Baldwin also talks about the ways in which the doctrine of white supremacy undermines the dignity of its would-be beneficiaries. He talks about the ways in which, he talks about essentially how pathetic it is that somebody like Sheriff Jim Clark, who's this Alabama law enforcement officer who's in that moment being seen on international, on televisions around the world and newspapers around the world, brutalizing men, women, and children in the streets of Alabama. Baldwin says, think about the moral life of somebody like Jim Clark. What has happened to a man, but he can do that to one of his fellow human beings. And so Baldwin, I think those are, a couple of the big, kind of themes of human dignity he raises in the debate. Then the one other thing I would mention is that, the idea, the way the motion was framed is this idea of expense. Baldwin, I think, really powerfully in the debate draws attention to the sort of legacy of economic and racial exploitation throughout history, and talks about this idea of the ways in which that history is present in all that we do. And so one of the most famous moments in the debate is when Baldwin says, I mean this quite literally, I picked the cotton, I built the railroads. And so I think part of what he's doing for the audience is just trying to say, that's not history, something that happened in the past. I'm not asking for your guilt for something, earlier generations, crimes earlier generations may have committed. What I'm asking for is your responsibility for the present, because that history is here in all that we do.
James Baldwin really was a darling of humanists in the UK. I remember one of the people who at the time was a young woman in the mid-20th century, the Cambridge Humanists, which at the time was the biggest humanist society in the UK. E.M. Forster was their president. It was incredibly large, talking about how when James Baldwin was in Cambridge, he came round to her and her husband's house for dinner with a committee of Cambridge Humanists. But it wasn't just on that face-to-face level. He was an intellectual inspiration of the humanist movement generally in the UK. And it's not difficult to see why when you describe his sort of basic worldview and the way that the vision that he laid out in that speech. And I think one of the things that is, and he's uncompromising, but he also displays, I think, what you've called a superhuman empathy for those who are caught in the grips of the delusions that he's arguing against. I think you say those who caught in the, I'm just going to read this from your book, it's so good. He displays an almost superhuman empathy for those caught in the grip of delusions like white supremacy. I think that's part of why he's inspirational for humanists who are engaged in a struggle of liberation too, because he really is understanding what he's up against, and he's treating everyone as human beings, not just the people that he's arguing for, but like you say, the victimizers who are themselves brutalized.
Yeah, exactly. I think that in the moment, in the debate, when, as I mentioned with Sheriff Jim Clark, I mean, he says to the audience, it would be easy to just treat Jim Clark as if he were a monster, right? But, then Baldwin has a relatively light moment in the debate, but has a really serious point when he says, I'm sure Jim Clark loves his wife and his children. I'm sure Jim Clark likes to get drunk. And the students, of course, get a laugh out of that. But I mean, Baldwin really does want them to recognize that, like, Clark is a human. He says Clark is a human being just like me, right? And so part of what, I think Baldwin is always doing is trying to dig through these questions of identity. He says Jim Clark, essentially has been taught his whole life to believe that his value is attached to the color of his skin, and that his role in the world is to maintain this fortress of white supremacy. And that's where he finds, his sense of meaning and value. And Baldwin, essentially says, like, part of the Baldwinian love, like this love of confrontation, it's a love of radical confrontation and radical empathy, is that we need to confront, this when we see it. And he says it may not be possible to save Jim Clark, but perhaps we can save his children, right? And saving them, and not in a patronizing way, but save them, like allow them to, like, liberate them from that so that they can live a truly fulfilling and, from Baldwin's point of view, moral human life.
There's so much to take from that. And I love that idea, both of this radical empathy, but also this real framing that, like you say, Baldwin's really consciously framing the civil rights struggle as a moral one. I think am I right in saying him and Lorraine Hansberry went before Kennedy and kind of asked him to consider it as such. And I'm interested, I guess, in whether Angelina, you also see that in the UK context. Is there also that idea of this being fundamentally a moral thing, or is it? What are the arguments that are being made in the UK at the time?
It's an interesting one, because I think, again, there are so many similarities, but also a lot of differences. People from the Caribbean, for example, people who came over. So first of all, we know that there's been a continuous African presence since the 16th century, right? Maybe even before Roman times, right? But if we're talking about the phase of migration that people like to sort of like center and mythologize as the time when that people suddenly appeared in the UK, is Windrush, right? It's 1948, June 1948, shit rocks up and everybody gets out. Well, 492 people. Actually, it's more than that, it's probably about 1,000. But they will say 492. But the thing is, with that narrative, those individuals, those men, women, and children that arrived at that particular point in time, those were British citizens. Yeah, they were British citizens. The Caribbean was part of the British Empire. And so when they arrived here, their assumption was that they were British citizens moving from one British space to another. Okay? And with that assumption came that one, if I leave Trinidad, if I leave Jamaica, if I leave Barbados, and I move to Manchester, London, Leeds, wherever I settle, they will know who I am. They will be recognized as British. And there will be, I imagine, some growing pains, some adjustments. I'm moving from across the Atlantic. So there will be some adjustments. I will be with majority white people. but we will adjust because I'm British. Okay? And that's what the British Nationality Act told everybody, not just Caribbeans, but also people who lived in Australia, South Africa, Canada. They were all British subjects. So the shock is quite profound that when you arrive here, that British people, ordinary, quote unquote, ordinary British people, have no idea of their empire. They have an idea that people of different ethnicities and races live among them, but they do not see these people as British. They see them as interlopers, encroachers, aliens, okay? The assumption that they would be able to seam into society without any problems and realizing that it was essentially quite terrible, an absolute shock for those men and women and children that arrived here. And so it's about the sort of identity, the British identity, that when they arrived here, they couldn't reconcile that they were British and yet they were being treated in so appallingly. You know, difficulties in all areas, difficulty finding housing, difficulty finding a job, the violence. You know, we talk about the Notting Hill so-called riots of 58 and the Nottingham riots of 1958. These were very alarming instances. People really couldn't get their head around. So the difference between sort of the United States and Britain was that the presence of African Americans has been sort of hundreds of years in one place, right? And they know they're there. They're in the South primarily, but they were moving up to northern towns in the early 20th century. Also, there was a significant presence in the UK throughout the 19th century and the 20th century onwards. And there was also a colour bar as well. There was a significant colour bar. You know, people weren't allowed to go into restaurants. They weren't allowed to go to pubs. They weren't allowed to find accommodation. And there was an activism that was going on there as well. I would say it was about belonging, the rights. They felt that there were rights that these citizens had from the Caribbean. And so they were really campaigning for civil rights. They were campaigning for the civil rights as British citizens that they believed that they were owed and that they deserved and that they expected. I guess I can't really sort of express how the absolute shock of people, because, you know, I say the shock because that's the education you received in the Caribbean. You received the British education. You didn't study the Africanness, the African people at school. Never. You would have never learned anything about your heritage as an African. You would have learned about Shakespeare. You would have learned about Henry VIII. You would have learned about everything British Industrial Revolution. You would have learned all of that. So your identity is completely tied up with British history and heritage.
I guess somebody like C.L.R. James is a kind of interesting example of that, maybe, in what he did, what he wrote about, and how he figured out identity.
C.L.R. James, probably Darcus, Howe, and others, they would have gone to an equivalent of a type of public school system, like Queen's College. In the different Caribbean countries, they had these kind of public school equivalents, and Stuart Hall as well. They would have passed a very tough exam to receive the best education on their respective islands. And that education would have been a British education. As I said, they would have learned nothing about Busser's rebellion or the Baptist rebellion or anything around Africanity there. So you carry this little Britain inside of you and you go over and you're like, I'm British too. I've learned about Britain just like you because we're British. And you're told you are not British. You do not belong here. And I believe that the impact of that must have been so profound. The impact of knowing that you're not British, despite having a British education, despite learning about British culture, you are not that thing.
Do you see people who had this British education and people like C.L.R. James? I mean, wasn't one of his first books published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf, I think? I mean, he had lots of connection points with, you know, as it were, elite humanists, you know, in their same sort of the social circles that they would have been in if they were white British people. Darcus, Howe, C.L.R, James Stuart Hall. These are people who then end up, is what you're saying, that they end up then arguing for equal treatment. And is that why the race relations actually sort of framed in terms of equal treatment? Because what they see themselves as deserving is that same citizenship and that same treatment as every other British person has. And is that slightly different then from this sort of competing moral vision of society that someone like James Baldwin is laying out for America? In Britain, these people from the Caribbean are largely seeking an equal stake in Britishness as it already exists.
Yeah, I would say that is correct, yes.
That's an interesting difference, isn't it? Nicholas, I don't know whether that inspires any thoughts for you, that difference.
A lot of what Angelina said struck me as really fascinating and important. And I think that, one of the things that came to mind is like this idea that, I would connect to what Baldwin says at the debate, is that, he sort of talks about this idea of like, we're not asking for something that isn't already ours, right? He basically says, my ancestors' blood is in the soil. Like, we've been here for hundreds of years. We fought in these wars. We've built the economy in so many different ways. He says, how is my freedom and citizenship possibly a question now? And so I think this idea of Baldwin had is that like, we've paid our dues, is like the way Baldwin would often phrase it. And the sort of idea, like he said, I'm not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. And so that idea is I think runs through, Baldwin's thought. He's not asking somebody like William F. Buckley or somebody like Robert Kennedy for something that he doesn't already deserve. The other line about that's really fascinating is, in the debate, is that Baldwin has a line about Robert Kennedy. Like, so Baldwin is there to challenge people, like conservatives like Buckley and liberals like Kennedy, who hadn't quite, from Baldwin's point of view, come around to a fully just view yet. And, Baldwin says, Robert Kennedy said recently that we could have a black president in 40 years. And, Baldwin says, that was treated as a very emancipated statement by most white people, but they weren't in Harlem barbershops when that statement was heard, where the reaction is like, Robert Kennedy just got here yesterday. We've been here for hundreds of years. And he's telling us that, one day, if we're good, we can be president too. So I think that there's a kind of way in which, I think some of the language Angelina used as well really struck me as something that Baldwin says, like that sense of shock, right? He says during the debate, it comes as a great shock. As a young person, he says, as a kid, to recognize that the country to which you have pledged allegiance has not pledged allegiance to you. So there's something about that really resonated with me as I heard Angelina describe the situation in the UK.
And Baldwin won the debate by a landslide, shall we say. And the backlash then, the shock that Buckley then felt, I again was reading that this, afterwards he kind of explained this away, or would, had this narrative about it, about how the vote was so lopsided because Baldwin was black and he hated America. He was a religious skeptic and a homosexual. Like all of these things that were like, this person does not belong. For one thing, it really resonated with me, and Andrew will know this because it's really similar to what Mary Whitehouse said when the Gay Humanist group was set up in the aftermath of her taking gay news to trial for blasphemy. And she said that the backlash against her when she was ultimately successful was because of a homosexual humanist intellectual lobby. This like imagined kind of collective conglomeration of everything that was seen to be, evil or bad to her. And this idea that Buckley has about, why Baldwin won and how it was kind of stacked against him because from the start, because of, all these things that he was, or all of these elements. And it's interesting as well that he does draw on this idea of him being a religious skeptic, as though, again, that is a kind of attack on American values, on the kind of civilization itself, which again I find quite, maybe this is another thing between a difference that seems to appear, whether fairly or not, between the kind of narratives in the UK and the US. I feel like quite a lot of really great scholarship has taken place by people like Anthony Pinn, Christopher Cameron, people like that, about these black free thinkers in the US, including people like Douglas, including people like Baldwin, also major civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph and people like that. But we haven't quite done that so successfully or so clearly maybe in the UK with those figures. It's like we don't. And I'd be really interested, Angelina, in what you think about this, because I was thinking recently, looking at the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, who they mark people, or they assign people, to various religions and things. And it's really amazing how many figures on the ODMB, lots of people that we've spoken about already, Olive Morris, C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones, Adelaide Hall, Darcus Howe, Stuart Hall, don't have any religion against them, but they similarly don't have anything like agnostic, atheist, humanist, freethinker or anything. And I wonder if that is seen as just less important? Is it the case that, like, I know somebody like C.L.R. James, he's been described before as almost politics being his religion, a little bit similar to somebody like, I think Claudia Jones has sometimes been referred to that as well. It's kind of an open question, really.
It's a big one. Somebody like Darcus Howe was an atheist. I would say that he probably operated a really strong, unwavering secular commitment to the cause. Like his uncle, C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James was also an atheist. And even though Darcus Howe's father was an Anglican priest, he grew up within the religious tradition. Darcus Howe was so committed. He comes from the next phase. So you had the people who came over in the 40s, right, the 1940s, their children were completely different. Those children became radicalized. Those children became understood and became very angry at the rejection. So they didn't care. They weren't even interested about Britishness. They were more interested in blackness. And Darcus Howe was kind of part of that. So Olive Morris as well. They were really part of a radical black tradition. And I think that Darcus Howe, in his work as a journalist, as a writer, he published Race Today, where it was really gathering information about sort of all the sort of inequalities and thinking about black thought, black British thought, intellectual thought. Those are the people that would be Darcus Howe, would be Olive Morris, although she didn't write as much. Certainly Claudia Jones and people like John LaRose. John LaRose was writing a lot about this. And sort of George Cadmore, who also was an atheist as well. I don't know if they would have described themselves as humanists. I don't know that. But they were certainly, Howe was dedicating his life to racial injustice. And during the Mangrove trial, he and Althea Jones-LeCointe, they defended themselves. They didn't have lawyers. They cross-examined the police in that case, and quite successfully so, to the point that the judge was saying he said there was animosity, racism on both sides. But they got off. They were found not guilty for affray, which is a very serious offence. They were part of the Black British Panther Party, along with many others. I mean, and also through art as well. So people like Linton Kwesi Johnson, who was a Black Panther as well. He used poetry, he used dub poetry to kind of express what the youth were experiencing in the 70s and 80s. Very powerfully, I think.
Nicholas, are we romanticising, Maddie said, and I think we do often think this in the UK, there's lots of very explicit free thinking and humanist and secular figures in US, African American history and liberation, but not so much in the UK. Is that true, or are we romanticising the grass is always greener? I mean, I know it's not just Baldwin, it's, there's at least half the Harlem Renaissance as well, of our way of thinking. But is this an accurate description when you hear us from Britain saying things like this about the American movement?
I wouldn't claim to be an expert on, sort of like humanist movement, free thinking in the US, but I find in my own work, it's been really interesting to think about Douglass and, Baldwin and King as my three people I've spent the most time with. And obviously they're very different, especially on some of these questions, thinking about King and Baldwin, for example. As I was getting ready to have this conversation today, I mean, it's interesting to think about him in this register because he's such a complicated figure. And of course, it totally makes sense to me that the Cambridge Humanists would host him and he would be, a hero. Of course, I think he's sort of always, grappling with these questions, from his childhood, forward. He's really grappling with a lot of these big questions about theology and the intersection between theology and morality and politics. And so, yeah, I mean, when I think about, sort of Baldwin in this register, I think about the conversations with Malcolm X, for example, that happened in 1961 that folks can listen to audio recordings of those. And I would definitely recommend people do that because I think it's Baldwin at his kind of religious skeptic best, I think, in some ways, because there's a wonderful moment when he goes back and forth, with Malcolm for a while. And basically, Baldwin says, from my point of view, all theologies are suspect. He says the Nation of Islam is just as suspect as the rest of them. But, he basically says, I want to present the audience with this reckless idea of like confronting, I want to confront the world as myself, of not having to rely on something that ultimately has to be believed. And so there's something about this sort of, to me, fits Baldwin perfectly in this tradition. And then there's, other moments, and I would just highlight like his speech that he gives in July 1968. He's the keynote speaker at the World Council of Churches, and he's invited to speak there because their initial keynote speaker, the first person they invited, was King, and he had been assassinated in April of 68. And so I find that speech really fascinating because Baldwin is there before all these ministers, kind of reflecting on his relationship to Christianity writ large. And, essentially, delivers a very like religious speech, about, and basically makes the case that Jesus of Nazareth is one of the most betrayed human beings in world history. So I find that like there's definitely a really interesting, and robust tradition here. And then there's within that tradition, as far as I've engaged it, there's all this this complexity that I find both fascinating intellectually and also just important, politically, and also just humanly, as we all try to figure these things out ourselves.
Yeah, I'm really just so struck by all of what you were saying. Partly also it comes back, I think, right back to what Angelina was kind of saying at the very beginning about being more honest in when we do history and when we explore these figures and not trying to show them as one thing or another, not trying to claim them for one identity or another, particularly when their whole lives and their activism was so intertwined with those questions and with often challenging those assumptions or kind of simplistic labeling and things. But at the same time, it does really fascinate me how they did have these different, again, often very complex relationships with things like the church, institutions like that. And I know that, certainly in the British context, there's a huge amount of that that's very bound up with community and with identity in terms of how you're raised and where your kind of networks are. Did we see any of those figures? I mean, people like, say, Olive Morris, Claudia Jones, Darcus, Howe, obviously you mentioned, did they reflect on, challenge, were they working out their relationship with the church or with religious ideas in similar ways, or was it just not something that was so front and center?
I don't know that it was, but I did find a quote from Darcus Howe that I thought was quite interesting. But he said, "I have left Christianity behind, but I have brought with me the liberal notions that it gave me. My God was only generous, and my radicalism is the radicalism of Christ." And I sort of thought about what that meant. And I was kind of thinking about, sometimes we know how Christ is represented and how today, certainly in his lifetime, he was not considered to be divine. He was considered to be a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker, walked around with 12 other guys, and and nobody liked him very much. And then I think about, he keeps saying, I wonder, I don't want to upset some people there, but I wonder about his message. And he says the kingdom of heaven he says it's all inside of you. Yeah, everything that you need is within. Yeah, you don't need a list of like a 10 commandments to tell you how to be a decent human being. That's how I understand that. So I think that's what perhaps Darcus was saying. He wants people to be decent, right? Be a decent human being. Stop discriminating against people. Stop being violent against people. That's what he was working towards, and that's what he was campaigning for. The campaigning for was ultimately hoping that the end goal would be that people would stop being violent in all ways that a person can be violent. That's how I understand that statement.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and just living the values. I think it's interesting too that somebody like, you can talk about Christ and the example of that Leicester Secular Hall, for example, built by these secularist radicals in the 19th century, has a bust of Jesus Christ on the front of it. There was that recognition that whether you're taking that as a divine inspiration or not, as clearly they weren't, there is still that, those fundamental concepts of how to live, how to be good, how to be decent, as you say. And that does seem to come back again, or Baldwin seems to come back to that as well, Nicholas, in terms of the just goodness, empathy, kindness.
Yeah, I mean, I think with both, I would say with Douglas and Baldwin, the way one of my major kind of conclusions, and I don't think this is original to me, but about the way they thought about religion was, their fundamental question was, how does your belief system lead you to treat other human beings in the world? In a sense, like, of course, they're like engaging with actual religious traditions in all sorts of interesting and complex ways. But like, for me, like their religion, was justice, so trying to figure out. So when Baldwin, says, things like, if God doesn't make us more free, if your conception of God doesn't make you more free and more loving, then it's time we got rid of that conception of God. That doesn't mean necessarily, I think, for Baldwin, that he wants to get rid of all conceptions of God altogether. Maybe some, he finds to be more useful and possibly more believable. But, he saw so much. I mean, so much of what he's doing in a book like The Fire Next Time is pointing out all the ways in which these, ideas have been used to oppress people, right? And Douglas did the same thing. I mean, if you look at Douglas's most famous, so that's Baldwin's most famous book, and think about Douglas's most famous speech, his speech on July 5th, 1852, reflecting on what to the slave is the 4th of July. I mean, a huge portion of that speech, a portion of the speech that's often cut out when it's excerpted in all the anthologies, is an attack on American religious institutions for protecting the institution of slavery or ignoring the institution of slavery. And so Douglas sees this deep hypocrisy, and from his point of view, a deeply profane, kind of use of religious ideas in order to support oppression. And so I think that, that to me is, I think, really essential to Baldwin and to Douglas. And then, of course, with the work I've been doing on King is different, he's a minister, right? And he's definitely a minister. And so I've been, thinking, in sort of along different lines lately about how these ideas can be thought about in relation to civil rights. But I think that's the big thing, is like, I think for Douglas and for King and in a different way, and for Baldwin, I mean, justice really has to be at the core of the belief system for it to have what they think is, real value in the world.
This is probably almost seems obvious, but what do you feel like the relevance? What can we take from these figures today? Any of them? What's the lessons for now?
Where are we now? Look where we are, how religion is being used, how it's being weaponized. The same issues they're still very much present. They want to use religion to stop women's rights, reproductive rights, keeping people divided. We're not doing really great at the moment, if how religion is being utilized to enact more violence on people.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I'll just stick to Baldwin's relevance. I mean, I think that, now in the U.S., you have this toxic melange, of, Christian nationalism and these other forms of nationalism that have been ascendant in this country. When Baldwin saw in, the 1980s, as he was, nearing the end of his life, he saw the rise of the religious right. He wrote, these men, people like Jerry Falwell and others, like, they do not know the man from Galilee. And Baldwin sort of accused them also of weaponizing a kind of set of beliefs to advance a particular agenda. And so I think right now it feels like, somebody like Baldwin and his engagement with these ideas is so relevant, because he's again going to draw our attention to the ways in which ideas can be used in these traditions can be mobilized to a variety of different ends. And we have to recognize that people will often weaponize traditions in order to advance an agenda that has nothing to do with what Baldwin takes to be the best in those traditions. And so I think that, one of the things I love about watching Baldwin or thinking about Baldwin's engagement with various right-wing figures of his day is that he would often call them out, Buckley included, and others like the segregationist James Jackson Kilpatrick comes to mind, where he'd say to these guys, like, you claim to be conservatives and attempting to conserve something like quote unquote Western civilization or American civilization. And Baldwin would reveal all the ways in which they were, failing to conserve, the things of value in those traditions. And in fact, he would reveal them to be interested in conserving their own power more than anything else. And so I think that's a lot of what we see going on. I don't think, these Christian nationalist movements that we're seeing in the US right now, that's what it's about. It's about figuring out ways to rationalize the oppression of other people. It's not about any deeply felt religious conviction, as far as I can tell. I can't see into people's souls yet, but that's fine.
Thank you. So we always end the podcast by asking if you have a favorite atheist or a favorite humanist from history, whether somebody we've mentioned already or somebody else that you want to kind of give a shout out to at the end. I think I have to say Eslander or S.E. Robeson. So we did mention her briefly before. I'm just going to give her another shout out. She was a really accomplished anthropologist, but also an activist, writer, just an all-round amazing person, very committed to humanitarian action, to anti-colonialism, to anti-racism on both sides, again, of the Atlantic. She spent a lot of time in London and studied at the LSE, and so was connected very much to the British movement as well as the American movement for civil rights and indeed for international human rights all over the place. And I really like, there was a quote about her by somebody who'd worked with her, who after Eslander Robeson died said that she had loved life and loved humanity. And I think that kind of captures a lot of what we've been talking about, all of the figures really, and what they were working for ultimately.
Mine has to be C.L.R. James. I mean, what an amazing writer, what an incredible life, the people he met, the people he inspired, and apparently he was an incredible speaker. I've never actually heard him speak. Maybe there's a recording out there somewhere, but anyway, he's my favourite of the ones that we've talked about so far.
I think I will also choose C.L.R. James because I love his work, not only as an important sort of Marxist thinker, but also because he was a fantastic historian as well. In 1938, he wrote The Black Jacobins. And The Black Jacobins, he wrote that. I remember him actually I've seen a footage of him being interviewed. Actually, it might well have been by Stuart Hall back in maybe the early 80s, late 70s, where he said, the reason I wrote this book is because I wanted African Caribbean people and people generally to know about this amazing event, this amazing occurrence that took place in the late 18th century, where enslaved Africans in Haiti beat the French, they beat the Spanish and the British. They were able to, but this extraordinary, amazing accomplishment. And the work that he did, the work that he did actually going to French archives and, trying to translate, learn to translate or getting somebody to translate from, what an amazing piece of work. What an amazing legacy. If anything, if that was the only thing that he'd done, he would have been like this amazing individual. Him and Walter Rodney, of course, but he did a similar thing. So yeah, I would say, C.L.R. James.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, I think in part, as I've indicated throughout the conversation, I definitely think of, sort of Baldwin as having, a big part of Baldwin being in this tradition, and then maybe some complexities at the margin. So, but I've talked enough about Baldwin. I guess somebody who I, would think of as, one of Baldwin's collaborators, friends, ride or dies, is Lorraine Hansberry, who came up, you mentioned, Lorraine a little bit earlier, Maddie. And I don't know exactly if, Lorraine identified as a humanist in this sense, but I think that she seems to fit, and I think that many ways in which Lorraine was this, radical figure who lived, she lived such a short life, but in that short life, she just did so many powerful things artistically and politically. And I think of, Lorraine as being somebody who's fundamentally committed to this idea of human dignity and trying to utilize storytelling in order to bring real human lives, to the stage and allow people to see themselves on the stage, maybe for the first time, and to start, utilize art in order to bring about social change. And so I love that aspect of Lorraine's legacy. And then, just the more directly, sort of explicitly, political engagement of Lorraine Hansberry. You mentioned the famous meeting in May 1963 when Baldwin calls out the Kennedy administration by way of, a telegram for failing to take a proper, stance on civil rights in the midst of the Birmingham campaign. And Lorraine Hansberry, Baldwin, and several other artists, intellectuals are invited to meet with Kennedy and the Kennedy apartment overlooking Central Park. And it's in that moment that I think that you just see this really, I would call a radical humanism of Lorraine Hansberry, on display, where she's, sitting there with the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, the brother of the president, and just, really calling him to account, telling him their failure, if they're unwilling to really hear the words of somebody like the activist Jerome Smith, who's in the room, who bears, scars on his body from the civil rights struggle. If the Kennedys are unwilling to listen to him and to understand his experience, then there isn't much hope for the country. And so she says, to Kennedy at the end of that meeting, this isn't a quote unquote Negro problem. This isn't a kind of problem that has anything to do with the people in this room on this side of the table. This is a problem of American civilization. She says, I'm very concerned about the civilization that can produce photographs like the ones we're seeing out of Birmingham with, law enforcement officers with their feet on people's necks. And so there's something about that kind of radical humanism, this radical willingness to call the powerful to account. So I choose Lorraine Hansberry as my favorite humanist today.
Great example. I also think, and it's a whole other episode to talk about this, but bears saying, because you kind of mentioned it, the role of writers, poets, creatives, artists in, as you say, laying humanity bare, showing people as they are, exploring the power of empathy, of imagination, of all of those things. Exploring so many of these ideas. Was it Malcolm X who called James Baldwin the poet of civil rights? This idea of how you communicate these things, both in speeches, in political activism, but also in art and lectures. And I'm thinking of people like Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes and, so many other amazing writers and artists who were, again, all part of this, the struggle and the laying bare of it. Thank you both so much. It's been just really incredibly interesting. Lovely to meet you both and to discuss some of these things. Last but not least, I'll just ask you to let people listening to this know where they might be able to find out more about your work.
I don't know. I could have to say this. I write a lot of stuff and then I just put it up on LinkedIn. That's where I put my stuff.
I guess I have a website. Shout out to Nikki Terry, who did all the work on that. But so it's just www.nicholasbucola.com. And it's got, sort of a lot of, essays I've written and links to the books. And, I haven't done a good job updating the events thing. But I'm out there on the road sometimes. And hopefully I'll get back to the UK with this book or the next book. It's been wonderful to speak with both of you.
Yeah, a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Unholy Histories, the Humanist Heritage podcast, brought to you by Humanist UK. To join, support, or find out more about Humanist UK's campaigns and services, visit humanists.uk, or you can follow us on social media at Humanists UK. This podcast was produced by Humanize Live. Find out more about creating content for compassionate communities at www.humanize.live.
And you can find out more about the rich history and influence of humanism on the Humanist Heritage website at heritage.humanist.uk.